All right, well, thanks for coming. I've been asked to cover a few housekeeping issues first. My name's Jonathan, by the way. I'm filling in for Josh, probably poorly. Josh, as many of you know, is in China today and asked me if I would fill in. Peter Thiel is going to talk for about 25 minutes, then he's going to do Q&A for about the same amount of time. A couple notes on the questions. Please don't pitch. And please try to make the questions brief and make sure that they are, in fact, questions. If you're here, you already know Peter Thiel's background as a co-founder of PayPal and the first investor in Facebook. Peter is one of the greatest thinkers of our time, but he's also actively working to invest his money and his time to make the world better. And he volunteers for events like this to convince more of us to do the same. Claiming to be interested in founding a tech company and not reading Peter's 0 to 1 book would be like claiming to be interested in Christianity and not reading the Bible. Peter didn't write this, by the way. If you ask someone you know in Silicon Valley to introduce you to the smartest person they know, and then repeat that question with each subsequent person you meet, that process will eventually conclude with an introduction to Peter Thiel. So you get to skip that process today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Peter Thiel.
Gosh, this was like the most embarrassingly hagiographic introduction I've had, and I always nervous about being able to live up to the hype or such. But I want to maybe just
your mic's not on.
Mic's not on.
Nope.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Roger.
Great. So let's see. I want to maybe just, I don't want to have to talk that long. I want to make this as interactive as possible. But you know, in writing 0 to 1 and teaching about entrepreneurship, came out of this class that I taught at Stanford. Blake Masters, who's here with me, took some notes, and we sort of it went viral on the internet. We combined to write this book. But one of the challenges in writing about entrepreneurship or teaching about entrepreneurship is that you're always tempted to try to reduce it to some sort of a formula. Where you follow these steps and you will succeed. And my conviction is that in some ways there is no such formula at all, because I think every moment in the history of business, every moment in the history of technology happens only once. The next Mark Zuckerberg will not be building a social networking site. The next Larry Page won't build a search engine. The next Bill Gates won't be building an operating system company. And so if you're copying these people, in some sense, you're not learning from them. And so the sort of the point of departure for 0 to 1 is how does one think about these fantastic, one-of-a-kind companies that don't really necessarily fit a particular pattern, that are not being built. And I try to get at this question. Sort of the theme I try to use to get at this question is by various contrarian questions I pose, like what great business is nobody building, or the intellectual one, which I always like asking as an interview question, is tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And this is a shockingly hard interview question for people to answer, even when they can read on the internet that I ask it to people. And it's hard because we always have this, first of all, I think the truth is just conventional, it's just what everybody agrees to be true. If you have to come with some new truth, that requires an unbelievable amount of brilliance, really, really hard to do. But then if you actually think about it literally in the context of an interview where I'm asking you this question, the correct answer is not something like God doesn't exist or the education system is bad and screwed up, because any sort of conventional answer that you have will not be a good answer. And any answer the person who's asking the question will agree with is likely to be a bad answer. And so there is actually something often quite uncomfortable about good answer to this question, or about great businesses in areas that are very underexplored. And I think we live in this world where courage is in far shorter supply than genius. So I want to maybe give 3 quick answers. 0 to 1 is in some ways a whole set of answers I have to this question, things that I think are true about business that people don't agree with me on. I'll give you 3 quick answers today, and then let's open it up to more of a conversation. So answer number 1, This sort of flows out of this theme of the uniqueness of great companies, the one-of-a-kindness of great companies. Answer number one, most people think that capitalism and competition are synonyms, and I believe they are antonyms. I believe a capitalist is someone who's in the business of accumulating capital. A world of perfect competition is a world where all the profits are competed away. If you're a founder or an entrepreneur, you should always aim for monopoly. You want to build something that is so differentiated from the rest of the world that there is no competition at all. If you want to compete like crazy, you should open a restaurant. You will not make any money, but you will have lots of competition. So there's the opening line of Anna Karenina is that all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is sort of true of business, where I think all happy companies are different because they found something to do that's very differentiated from the rest of the world. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. And so you don't want to be the 4th online pet food company. You don't want to be the 10th thin film solar panel company. You don't want to be the 1,000th restaurant in Austin. I think this competition versus monopoly theme. It's not the only business idea, but it's the one that I think is always very poorly understood. And there's sort of both an intellectual and a psychological reason for this. The intellectual reason it's not understood is that the people who have monopolies pretend not to have them for reasons that I will leave to your imagination. And the people who don't have monopolies pretend to have them because they still want to tell some story about what they're doing is different and special in some sort of a way. And so when the two sort of pretend to be more alike, the essential difference ends up getting somehow obscured. The way people do this rhetorically is by distorting the nature of the markets they work in. And so if you are the Google search monopoly in Silicon Valley, you will never talk about search. They very rarely talk about search these days. You will instead talk about this much, much larger thing called technology. And you will say that you're facing enormous competition in all sorts of areas of technology. You're competing with Apple on the iPhone and Android. You're competing with Facebook and social. You're competing with Microsoft. You're competing with the car companies in Detroit as you're building a self-driving car. And you're in this vast space called technology, and there's competition everywhere. Conversely, if you were to sort of, at the end of this discussion today, try to run out of the meeting and decide to start a restaurant, you would and you then approached investors and they said, well, I don't want to invest in a restaurant because you're just going to lose money, since they mostly go out of business pretty quickly. You'd say, well, this is not just any restaurant, it's one of a kind. It will be the only British Nepalese fusion cuisine in Austin, Texas. And so you will tell sort of a fictional story about a market that is far too small. And so I think because of these sort of distortions that happen, this is an idea that always ends up being very, very underexplored. But I think there's also sort of a psychological reason for it that's worth saying a little bit about. When the Wall Street Journal excerpted the chapter in my book entitled "All Happy Companies Are Different," they sort of get to retitle it, and they sort of came with a slightly punchier title. It's "Competition is for Losers," which sort of is very counterintuitive, because we always think of the losers as the people who don't compete that well. The losers are the people who are the slow people on the high school swimming team, or the people whose grades or test scores aren't quite good enough. And we think of, and it's because we often define what's meaningful and valuable in terms of competition instead of thinking of these things on their own. And when you compete with people, you do get better at that which you are competing on. But you often lose sight of what is important, valuable, meaningful in the process. And this is sort of the autobiographical part of this. Is always sort of the advice I would give my younger self, where I was sort of hyper-tracked in all these super competitive contexts. When I was in 8th grade at junior high school, one of my friends in my yearbook wrote in, I know you're going to make it to Stanford in 4 years. I ended up at Stanford, went to Stanford Law School. I ended up a few years later at a sort of big Manhattan law firm. And it was one of these places where from the outside everybody was trying to get in, from the inside everybody was trying to get out. And after I left, after 7 months and 3 days, One of the people down the hall from me said that it was reassuring to see me leave. He had no idea that it was possible to escape from Alcatraz, which of course was not literally true, since all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But psychologically, this is very hard to do because so much of our identity ends up getting wrapped up in the people we're fighting, the people we're competing against. And I think this is extremely overrated and needs to be sort of rethought from scratch in these businesses. And I think the great businesses are ones that don't try to incrementally improve on something or try to narrowly disrupt some existing business, but they're often ones that do things that are quite orthogonal. It tends to be met with resistance and incomprehension. One of my colleagues from PayPal, Elon Musk, afterwards started Tesla and SpaceX, the electric car company, and the rocket company. And it's I think it's at this point hard to fully reconstruct how widely ridiculed this was in Silicon Valley for how many years afterwards. He started these companies in 2002. Even in 2008, when when Founders Fund was the first outside investor in SpaceX, we were attacked by our own LPs for this being the dumbest investment any venture firm had ever made. And it is because anything that is sort of one of a kind, that doesn't fit a pattern, is something I think we generally are quite uncomfortable about. One of the questions I often get asked is, what sort of trends do I see happening in technology? What themes do I think are happening? What's the future going to look like? I'm always very uncomfortable with that question, but the systematic answer I have is that I'm skeptical of all themes. I think all themes are overhyped. So I'm skeptical of educational software, I'm skeptical of healthcare IT software, I'm skeptical of genomics, I'm skeptical of SaaS, super skeptical of cloud and big data. I think when you hear those words, you should almost think fraud. And the problem is that when you have something that gets described in these sort of abstract, thematic ways, it's likely that you have not really thought hard enough about the particular granular differentiation that will really make your business one of a kind. So when one hears buzzwords, it's a tell, like in poker, that there's no monopoly. The buzzwords tell you that that you haven't figured out something unique to do. There's a lot more that I can say about this, but I would say the other sort of second conviction that I have very deeply is that there are many interesting things left to be explored. So I don't think that we are sort of at this end of history where most ideas have been found, most answers to this question, what great business has nobody built, have been answered. I think there's certainly certain places where the frontier is closed. There's not much of a geographic frontier left on this planet. So if you want to become an explorer like in the 17th century, you're probably not going to have many interesting places left to explore. There's certain subjects, like basic chemistry, there are no elements left to be discovered on the periodic table. So there are certain fields that are complete, they're sort of finished, where it's unlikely you will find many new things. But I have the conviction that there actually are, many such fields. I think it's very natural to focus on computers and information technology because this is an area that's worked tremendously and I think will continue to work. I personally would also always like people to do more in a number of other verticals, biotech, medical devices, energy, all sorts of other problems. But I think this frontier is still very reachable. It doesn't necessarily require 10 years of a postdoctoral education to get to the interesting frontier. There often are very interesting places one can get to very early on, and there are many such places left. And we often we have all these sort of self-defeating ways that we tell ourselves that it's hard to do this. We sort of think, we live in this world of 7 billion people, and it's impossible to have an original idea because if I have an original idea, someone else will have already thought of it before me. And then anything that's truly original is impossibly hard because, but it's not the case that all 7 billion people are thinking the same thoughts and doing the same things. And so I think there are a lot of fairly somewhat idiosyncratic but interesting verticals that can be explored a lot more. there is this very strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where so many of the people in the tech industry seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's, and I think we always need to sort of flip this around and see this as really a critique of our whole society. And we need to ask the question, what is it about our society where anybody who does not have Asperger's, who is socially well adapted, will be talked out of all of their interesting, heterodox, creative ideas before they're even fully formed, because they will pick up on social subtle cues from the people around them, telling them, oh, that is too weird, that's a little bit strange, no, maybe you should not do that, you should stick with the restaurant, or you should stick with the online pet food company, because that's something that's been done before and that's more straightforward. And I do think this need to break out of this stuff is always a very tricky thing. They've done these sociological studies of business schools where you have you can sort of think of, I often think of business people in business schools as the anti-Asperger's demographic, sort of people who are extremely extroverted, often somewhat low conviction, and you sort of put them in a hothouse environment for 2 years. And at the end of it, they sort of talk to one another, and they all sort of conclude they should all catch the last wave. And so, in '89 at Harvard Business School, most people wanted to work for Michael Milken a few years before the junk bond thing blew up. In '99, 2000, they all wanted to work on tech startups in Silicon Valley for the first and last time, because and perfectly timed the end of the dot-com bubble. And so I think there is sort of this aspect of this that we're all very, very prone to. The word ape already in the time of Shakespeare meant both primate and to imitate, and we rarely want to acknowledge how big a role this plays in things. And I always think that imitation is important. It's how we learn language as kids. It's how culture gets transmitted. But it also leads to bubbles, the madness of crowds, all sorts of crazy peer pressure dynamics. And I think it's always understated how much it distorts our thinking. When I was raising money for a Founders Fund a year ago, you meet all these different investors, and whether you're a VC raising money from LPs or a founder raising money from venture capitalists, I had sort of this unbidden thought that there was only one question that everybody had, that every single person I had, that nobody asked. And the one question they were all too embarrassed to ask was, are other people investing as well? Because nobody ever wants to come forward and say, I'm a completely sheep-like person who has no opinions of my own, and is simply looking to all the people around me to make up their minds for me, and then they're making up their minds. I'm making up my mind for them, and sort of this reciprocal bubble. And it is a disturbing degree to which this is true, and I think this is always the challenge for us to escape from. This is why this is sort of the challenge in building these technology businesses. Last contrarian thought. I always contrast these two different modalities of progress, globalization and technology. I think of globalization as copying things that work, going from one to N, horizontal or extensive growth. China is the paradigm of globalization. All that China has to do is copy the West. It can skip a few steps here and there, but it's really, really straightforward. Technology, I was drawn a y-axis. It's vertical, intensive progress, going from 0 to 1, doing new things. And I think that you can have sort of globalization or technology or both. We probably want to have both in the 21st century. But the last 200 years, it's been sort of a mixed story. The 19th century was a period of both tremendous globalization and tremendous technology. 1914 onwards, technology kept progressing. Globalization kind of went into reverse with world wars, communism, the world falling apart in all sorts of different ways. And I think globalization came back after Kissinger went to China in 1971, and the last 40 years have seen globalization with a vengeance, and perhaps somewhat more limited progress in technology, mostly around IT and computers. And it's reflected in the different ways we talk about the world. In the 1950s or 1960s, you would have divided the world into the first world and the third world. The first world was that part of the world that was technologically accelerating. The third world was that part that was sort of permanently screwed up. Today, we basically talk about the developing and developed worlds. The developing countries are those countries that are copying the developed world, and so it's this pro-globalization convergence theory of history. But it is also implicitly an anti-technological account, because when we say that we live in the developed world, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world where things are done, finished, nothing new is going to happen, and where we should resign ourselves to decades of relative stagnation ahead, where the younger generation should expect to be less well off than their parents. And I think these are conceptions that we should resist very strenuously. And so I'll end with the somewhat contrarian question that I think we all should ask and answer anew, which is how do we go about developing the so-called developed world? Thank you very much.
If you have questions, just raise your hand.
Hey, so I saw this thing online where you and Gary Kasparov go around New York, and y'all went to a robotics laboratory with all these like young college students, and they were like proudly showing off all their robots and stuff like that. And you and Gary just basically ripped them.
More Gary than me, but yes.
More Gary. He was like, this is crap from the 60s, and they were just like, oh my God, like, this is all our hard work. So my question is, how do people react to that kind of thing when you come in with such contrarian review? Do they just totally reject it and be like, these guys are assholes? Or do they actually say, you know, maybe we are thinking small? What's the typical way it goes?
Well, I think, let's see, well, I think that particular context was more Gary than me, so I'm not throwing him under the bus or anything, mind you. But I think, I don't think, for the most part, I don't think you should be super critical of anyone who's working on different things. We have this tagline on our website where it's, they promised us flying cars and all we got was 140 characters. And people always say, oh, you must really hate Twitter, and so this terrible anti-Twitter comment. And to put this in some context, I think Twitter is a great business. They have a fantastic monopoly. The people who work there will be gainfully employed, regardless of what precisely they do for the next decade or two. And at the same time, there's a sense that this is perhaps not enough to take our civilization to the next level. But it's a mistake to blame Twitter specifically, and so it's more something all of us need to be working on. So I think that's the context. It's this idea that we've had innovation in computers and less innovation in other fields. I think I don't get that much pushback on that idea. I got a lot more pushback when I started developing this 3-4 years ago. So I think there are sort of a lot of people who come around to believing it in varying degrees. And then there's sort of a lot of nuances. Is it enough to innovate around computers? And certainly it's an optimistic scenario where that's going to accelerate and that will propel a lot of change on its own. My thought is that it's probably going to be important for us to do things both in the world of bits and the world of atoms. And maybe a lot of interesting businesses are ones that somehow reintegrate those two.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How would you address the complex problem of fixing grade school education, knowing that where they seem to be moving us into this more of, like what you mentioned, where going to Harvard and doing the sheep thing versus coming up with your own idea and being accepted for that and really going after that, and just more about math and science and not about that individualism or creativity that you mentioned. How would you, it's a complex issue, so how would you address that?
I do think the education system is fairly screwed up on all, K through 16, really,
Yeah.
all the way up and down the line, maybe preschool through 16. My own thought is that the place where you want to try to reform things is on the university level. That's typically where people amass enormous amounts of student debt, which I think is sort of the single most catastrophic thing that's happening in education. If you graduate with $100,000 in debt, that really burdens you. And I do think it somehow shapes everything else. And so if we say that you go to Yale or you go to jail, This is sort of the frame that you'll be saved if you get a diploma. If you don't get a diploma, you'll go to hell, or something like that. This is sort of it's like the universities are like it's like this weird successor to the Catholic Church or something. And so I think that's and so I think that's why I think you want to change the paradigm in terms of how people think the end is. As long as it's all about the universities, you're going to have the same very conventionally tracked K through 12 education, which there's a lot that's probably wrong. There are probably a lot of subjects people study that don't make sense. There are a lot of subjects they don't study. It would be good to. It's not at all obvious everyone should be studying the exact same things. So there's all sorts of stuff that's very off. But I think it all gets shaped by the end game.
Thank you.
Yeah, Beck.
Why did you become a venture capitalist? Why do you stay in it?
Well, I like technology. I like working with founders. I think it's I started PayPal. I started another company, Palantir, back in 2004. So I have founded 2 companies and fairly involved on. I've been sort of both a founder and a venture capitalist. I think it is actually quite hard to start another company once you've been extraordinarily successful. Because I think a lot of these startups, there's sort of it's very critically dependent on a certain esprit de corps when you start, and if you've had someone who's made an enormous amount of money, the other people involved will subtly think you're not really in this and all fully on board or stuff like that. So I think there's sort of a weird way in which I'm not sure I could actually start another startup company successfully. So I'm a venture capitalist instead. Yeah.
20 under 20. What's your take on how that program is going? Happy with the results?
Well, I think it's going fairly well. I think there's always are ways that things could be improved. We've had 4 classes at this point, about 20 students stopped out of college or each year. It's been about 83 people have sort of gone through the program at this point. There's sort of a number of successful businesses and a few good exits. I think it's been an incredible learning experience across the board. And then there's sort of all sorts of incremental ways that we're looking to improve it in the years ahead. But I think there's no right age for people to become an entrepreneur. I think you can do it when you're under 20. You can do it when you're over 50. And at the same time, I think there is something often very important about certain points in your life where you're maybe more open to trying new things, and that's why I think there's sort of something around the college experience where people often end up drifting into a certain trajectory with their lives that's not fully thought through. And so that's sort of why we thought this would be a good point at which people should think about it. So I think it's worked on a micro scale, and on a macro scale, I think it's triggered a very much broader discussion about education than I would have ever expected. I mean, it was not intended as a frontal assault on all the universities. I don't think all the universities should be shut down. I don't think nobody should go. I don't think it is the case that nobody should go to college. I don't think it is the case that everybody should be an entrepreneur. I just think that we need more heterogeneity. There should be no one track for everybody. Yes.
What's your demarcation between iteration and innovation? A lot of the top companies that we look at as examples, like Apple, Google, Facebook, even Tesla, are an iteration of an existing product that may be innovative, but it's still an iteration. So, how do you define the difference between the two?
Well, I think you sort of I don't know. I'm not sure there's a precise definition. I'm certainly interested in things that are somewhat larger quantum leaps, and I think whenever you have something that's just a narrow iteration, it's likely that it's not that different from what came before, and therefore you've not really succeeded in escaping from competition in one way or another. So the business strategy perspective, I always think of it: is it enough of a jump that you have a potential for a monopoly here? Now there's certainly a context where it can be very hard to figure out. So at the time Google was founded, people would say there were lots of search engines. This is just another search engine, and so it's just an iteration on search. The other perspective on Google would have been that it was the first machine-aided search with a PageRank algorithm, and so it was actually a massive improvement, and sort of made search into this much bigger field than people before had suspected was possible. And so I think I would say Google was actually a very big jump that might have looked like it was just an iteration. So you always want to really figure out what's going on. I think there is a certain modality that's it's often not best for startups because it's a little bit more capital intensive, but of innovation around that involves complex coordination, where you sort of take many different pieces and you pull them together in just the right way. And I think this was perhaps the key to Tesla or the Apple iPhone, where you could say you can't point to any single component that involves some sort of giant breakthrough, but it was actually pulling together a whole bunch of different things in this complex coordination that had not been done, and the complex coordination was a big improvement. And so you got sort of a much better car with Tesla. You got a smartphone that just worked when the iPhone was released. So I think that's sort of a modality. It tends to be somewhat more capital intensive, which is why it's often very hard to get venture funding for those sorts of things. But yeah, I think it's always this very important question. Sometimes you can do all right with just something very small if you have this hyper-viral growth. So I think there's sort of a subset of these consumer internet companies where you just figure out one thing, but it's tied to a distribution channel that really works. And so these are the virally growing things like Instagram or Pinterest or Snapchat, where you can say you tweaked one thing, but you got this explosive growth, and that could be enough, because there's always you can have barriers to entry through technology or through the distribution channel. One of the things people always underestimate is how hard, if you build something new, how hard is it to actually get it distributed. And so if you can have a small iteration on the product, but a big jump on the distribution channel, where for some reason it will grow super fast or will get adopted much more easily, that can also be an important form of innovation. Yes?
You may have a very different answer now, but what were the top 3 reasons you invested in Facebook?
Well, it certainly had very little to do with the dynamics of the pitch meeting, which is always the question I always get asked is what happened in the meeting, or Zuckerberg was introverted, Sean Parker did most of the talking, there was a sense that it was growing very fast. There was a sense that the valuation wasn't very high. They only needed money to buy more computers because people wanted to use the product. So that's always a pretty good proposition for these companies. Reid Hoffman and I have been talking about social networking things for quite a long time. Reid had started a company. Reid ended up starting LinkedIn, but he had started a company in '97 called SocialNet. So they already had the name social networking in the name of the company. It was all around. You'd be a cat and I'd be a dog, and we'd have these avatars and we'd interact in cyberspace. It was all about fictional things. It didn't quite work. But we thought a lot about the social networking things over the years. So we had done our homework and we're ready for it. I would say the monopoly analysis that I had. If the goal is to have a monopoly, you get to a monopoly as a startup by going after a small market, not a big market, because you want to get to big market share. So Facebook started with 10,000 people at Harvard and went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. So that's sort of a very auspicious start. And I sort of modeled it as a sum of a lot of local monopolies on all these different college campuses. And I think, and that's I didn't think it would get to be as big as it got, but that certainly suggested it still had tremendous prospects. I think there's the weird question I think always can be asked about the Facebook piece was why no one else had invested in it before. And so I met them in August of '04. They started in February '04 in Boston. And they moved to California for the summer of '04. And I think there is sort of this very weird dynamic where none of the VCs in Boston wanted to invest. And I have all sorts of crazy theories on this, but I'm not sure they're right. Yeah?
When you're researching or analyzing problems, do you have any practices or rituals you engage in to try to free yourself from preconceived notions?
You know, I never know if I never know if there's sort of a great formulaic approach to this, but I am always interested in this question of, are there psychological blind spots? Are there reasons that you know, you're inclined to think things in a certain way and not free yourself? So that's always a question that I try to get a big handle on. And there's a lot of examples of this. But sort of as a, I think, for example, I think there's I think as an investor, there always are these two questions I'd like to have an answer to. One is this a good company? And then why do other people not understand that this is a good company? Because it's only when you have a good answer to the second question that it somehow is a really great investment. And so there's always this question: are there some systematic ways people have blind spots, that they're missing things, they're not understanding things? You know, I think there's an investor bias where people are always biased to things they themselves use. And so I think you know, current example in Silicon Valley would be, I think investors are too bullish on Uber because they like personally driving black town cars, and they are not bullish enough on Airbnb because they don't like sleeping on couches in people's homes. And so, you know, if these were public companies, I think it would be very clear: long Airbnb, short Uber, pair trade you would do. Facebook was probably a blind spot with Facebook where because investors were not in college, they underestimated the intensity of the college usage, and I think there's probably a case maybe Facebook was undervalued for the first 3 years. So I think there are sort of all these questions I always come back to: is there some reason that there's a blind spot? But the you know, in general, I'm always a little bit skeptical of these sort of procedural shortcuts. They're sort of very powerful, but I think it's always better to really drill down on the substance, because I think we're sort of we live in a world where people are used to procedural shortcuts, and it's always, what's the formula, what's the shortcut, how do I quickly get there, how do I skip all the hard work that I'm supposed to do, and there's definitely room for shortcuts, but in a world where everyone's trying to find every shortcut they can, the most contrarian thing is to actually just really drill into the substance of subjects, and I think that's what people do surprisingly little. Yeah.
I'm in the corporate wellness industry, and I'm deeply skeptical of the word corporate wellness. And how do you go about speaking a language, a new language, with terms, you know, that already exist to describe your industry?
So yeah, I'm actually, that sounds almost on par with big data or cloud computing.
Right.
That's my reaction. So I share your sentiment. I guess it always depends who the audience is that you're communicating with. I don't like buzzwords because when you're compelled to use them, you're compelled to somehow conform, and you can't differentiate what you're doing. And that's why it always sounds like it's more of the same in one way or the other. So I think the challenge is always to differentiate very powerfully. But you know, this is sort of like there is sort of this Zen paradox to marketing, and it's you know, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, I think you have to simultaneously convince them of two diametrically opposite things. One is, I am just like you, so you can trust me. And second, I'm not like you at all, and that's why I have ideas that are different from yours. And that's why, you know, I have something to offer that you can't get on your own. And so I think that's always like this very tricky paradox that, you know, it's like I'm trying to convince investors to invest in my venture fund. It's like you have to convince them that you're just like them, so they will trust you, and you have to convince them that you're really different, because otherwise they'd just be investing the money themselves. And So I think that's always the paradox. My bias is always to skew more on the differentiation side. It's better to stress how you're different. It's better to drop the buzzwords. It's better to just say something that sounds really different, because that's how you're more likely to break through the clutter. But it has downsides, and because very often people won't know what you're talking about and they'll get lost. Yeah.
Peter, you and a lot of venture capitalists have started to take some very strong positions on public policy. Is that because you see government starting to change its tune and not being so in love with the tech sector? Or do you think that you need government to come up with policies for the enhance the tech sector?
Well, I sort of get pulled into this political stuff because people always ask me for my opinions on this. And I'm not actually that, that obsessed with, I have views on things. They're sort of probably skewed politically in somewhat libertarian direction. But at the end of the day, I'm actually not sure that politics is really the key to solving all our problems. It permeates our system. There are all these places where it seems important, it blocks things. Maybe there are cases where it could help things, but in practice, I suspect it always is an endlessly frustrating morass to get involved in. And I think that if I lived in DC, I think I would be really depressed. So sort of, it's important. It's a hobby, but I wouldn't want to define myself by that. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the pieces of advice entrepreneurs get is to validate your idea with your target audience. Build something people want. But earlier you said that ideas might be good ideas are often met with skepticism or some befuddlement. And could that category of people that are befuddled by your good idea include your target audience, or is that you might disregard somebody's killing something like that? In other words,
yes.
They are.
Yes. Well, I think let's. There's a lot of different nuances here. Let's differentiate testing and getting feedback on the one hand versus building something that people want. So I think those two things, they're similar, but I think they're actually meaningfully different. So, and I do think, I think that if you, there's nothing wrong with getting some feedback, and you should definitely listen to what people are saying and what people are doing, and you shouldn't be oblivious to this. I'm always a little bit partial though to the sort of more this model where you have a ESP connection with the world at large, and you intuit what people want, and that's what you build. This is sort of what I think a lot of the great product visionaries did. I don't think Steve Jobs did that many focus groups or things like that. He built things that people wanted, but it was not through the sort of marketing focus group driven approach. The concern that I have with focus groups and the sort of iterative feedback that I think is so in vogue is that even though in theory I think it helps, I think in practice it ends up becoming an excuse for not thinking hard enough. And so if you say, well, I don't know what people want, I'm going to do a focus group, and I'll try to figure it out through the focus group. In practice, I think you're often selling your ability to think about what people want short. And I think you can actually figure out, is this a product that people will want or not? And you have to be honest, you have to sort of be very critical in the analysis, but I think we sort of often hide behind not knowing what people want as a way to go down a lot of things that we could have perhaps avoided going down in the first place. So I do think, a lot of the great businesses were built around sort of fairly strongly held convictions of things that were important, and then at some point down the line, you had focus groups, you iterated, you tweaked the product. But I don't think that's how you start. Yeah.
Can you give us your perspective about innovation in the payments world? How fragmented it is, what's happening with PayPal, introduction of Apple Pay. Give us your perspective of how do you see payments moving forward?
Well, Let me again frame this in the monopoly competition framework. So I'm always interested in things where you have relatively small markets where there's a sort of a very intense need for your product, because that means you can sort of get over all the inertia to adoption, and you'll get people to adopt it. And I'm always more skeptical of vast markets where a lot of people have a small need for your product. And payments is, I think, an area that's especially prone to this sort of, mile wide but inch deep kind of thinking, where we can envision better payment systems that will be given to hundreds of millions or billions of people and will make everything a little bit better. Those things tend to be super hard to adopt. And so I think it's always a question, is there something, a new modality you can use that will be used by a small number of people initially, but where the need is really big? PayPal started with buyers and sellers on eBay. There were maybe 20,000 power sellers. They could get paid instantaneously versus waiting for 7 to 10 days for a check to clear. And so that was sort of a very big need, and you got sort of very fast adoption. Stripe has, I think, done a great job of reaching out to the developer community. So it has a product that's really great for web designers to integrate into websites, and that sort of they sort of did a quantum leap on the distribution channel in a way, and that was very important. I'm somewhat more skeptical of the Apple Pay kind of a model, because maybe it can work if they really get all the industry partners to do things, and you sort of get this very widespread change. My suspicion, it's the sort of thing that you could never do as a startup, certainly. And it has more that mile wide, inch deep feel where, is it really that valuable to people? In most cases, we have a payment system that's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And when you have things that are pretty good, it's often hard to go from pretty good to very good to perfect. The deltas are too small. So you want to focus on things that are really bad and go from really bad to perfect.
Kind of piggybacking on the payments topic. So when you formed PayPal, you probably had some very, I think, noble ideas about how it could change the way that people interact with money, how they could control their money in ways which were very different than what they were doing at that point in time. Do you think PayPal has achieved that? Do you think that they're in that direction? They have some ways to go?
Well, you always have to sort of differentiate a payment system and a currency. We had all these ideas about creating a whole new currency. The PayPal, the company T-shirts were PayPal, the new world currency, and we ended up not actually creating a new currency. It was just dollars and euros, and used all sorts of more conventional currencies. So we're definitely ways that we had this sort of extremely ambitious vision that we couldn't quite figure out how to implement. I often think of Bitcoin as sort of the other version of this, where it has actually succeeded in creating a new currency, at least on the level of speculation. But it's probably still somewhat lacking on the payment system, where it's hard to transact quickly. And I think that was sort of one of the key challenges with Bitcoin. Can you get the payment part of that to work?
Time for one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So earlier you mentioned Facebook's valuation when you invested in it being low. At the time, Facebook was not making money or was not near making money. So how do you think about that in an age where you see WhatsApp, you see Snapchat, you see all these massive valuations? How do you think about that as an investor? And then also, that's a very real challenge for entrepreneurs. In how am I going to convert this business into a revenue generator?
Mm-hmm.
So, what's your advice on that as well?
Well, let's see. Again, these are sort of very broad, general questions. But I would say the critical component for an awful lot of these businesses, if you sort of think about what's the value of business, go sort of just classic finance economics. The value of a company is the sum of its discounted cash flows. And so for a startup, the two critical questions are, what is the growth going to be? And then, how long does it last? What's the terminal value? And I think you sort of need both a growth story and a durability story. We did this exercise at PayPal in 2001. In March 01, we've been in business for 27 months. What was the value of PayPal? And when you had sort of a very high growth rate, we're still losing money once. We're still not profitable, still negative. We had a high growth rate, pretty high discount rate. The growth rate was higher than the discount rate. So about 75% of the value of the company came from cash flows in years 2011 and beyond. And this is what the math tells you for all these companies. If you look at Twitter, Facebook, every single tech startup in Austin, 75 to 90% of the value comes from cash flows in years 2024 and beyond. And so I think, as an investor, there's sort of always these, or as an entrepreneur, there are these two. One question is there going to be a lot of growth? But then the durability question somehow is actually perhaps even more important and generally very underexplored. I think we certainly overvalue near-term cash flows. So that's a massive bias we have. We probably somewhat overvalue growth and undervalue durability, at least relative to one another, because growth is measurable. Durability has this much more qualitative feel, and we have this bias where if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist at all. But I think that's probably one of the things investors got wrong with companies like Zynga or Groupon. We had crazy growth metrics, but it turned out that it was not durable because Zynga had to come up with new games, with new hits. Groupon had sort of a bad experience for a lot of the small businesses, and so the small businesses came very quickly, but then also left very quickly. So I think it would have been, it was a little bit 20/20 hindsight, but the focusing on the durability question is one that I think is always really critical. But those are sort of the pieces you want to look at. It's not enough for your company to take over the whole world. It has to also last. So you had disk drive manufacturing in the 1980s. You could come up with a new disk drive that was better than anybody else's in the world. You could take over the whole world, and 18 months someone else would come along with something better and replace yours. And so this was good for society because 10, 15 years later you had much better disk drives, much cheaper, smaller, more storage. But all the companies that made them sort of kind of gone out of business. And so I think this growth plus durability are the metrics I'd always look at.
Okay. Peter will be staying after for about 15 minutes to sign books. Thank you for doing that. And thank you, Peter Thiel, for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.